Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Hoop Axis. This is my second episode with Katherine D, my good friend, and OG Interintellect member. Before you guys joined us, we were just reminiscing about the early days of Interintellect. I think 2019, 2020, Kat, you already had been popping up at Interintellect salons. I remember that before the pandemic, we did an offline event with Hollis Robbins in Mountain View, if I'm not mistaken. And the topic was the Englander short story, what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank. Is that the title?
Yes. Yeah, that's what it was. I totally forgot until you mentioned it.
It just kind of popped into my head. I don't know if that's the title. Is that the title?
I think so.
Very interesting and painfully timely short story that I remember Hollis was extremely enthusiastic about to discuss, where basically two couples during a long drunken night after a dinner together somewhere in New York basically play this weird game whether the friends would hide each other in the event of a persecution, in the event of genocide. And of course, during the past year, this short story came back to my mind a lot. I really recommend not to play with this, not to play this with your friends. But it's an interesting reminder that, a lot of the social graces that we have with each other might be more superficial than we think. And I think that's something very strongly there in your work as well. I remember the first time I came across your work as Default Friend on the Default blog. And then you had the After the Orgy podcast. You run the Computer Room podcast these days. That you basically started using Tumblr as a container, as a framework for understanding our current culture and the whole millennial mindset, especially now that the millennials are becoming middle-aged and we are becoming, for better or worse, the leaders of the world. How our mindset is built is becoming a very important question. We need to understand where our inspirations are coming from, or our fears. So I'm so glad that you joined me. This is a very new podcast. I still have no idea what I'm doing, which is kind of a good feeling. I don't like routine, so that's when it becomes a routine, somebody else will take over hosting. You also hosted more recent Interintellect salons. I think the most recent one was with Caroline Calloway and Tara Isabella Burton on Caroline Calloway's book. And you always bring a very fresh, nuanced, new way of looking at internet culture. There's a lot happening on the internet, ironically, today that vilifies our online existence. I, for one, as a millennial, always felt that basically the only thing that's really stable in my life is the internet. A couple of years ago, we hosted an Interintellect salon with Emma Shear, who was at the time still the CEO of Twitch, and Visa Verasamy, our favorite online guru. And it was called Home on the Internet. And I think that title really resonates with our generation. We happen to be home on the internet. So welcome to the Hope Axis. Kat, how are you doing? Where are you and what's going on with you these days?
I'm in Chicago. I'm doing pretty well. I'm a little sleepy, but that's life. I don't know what's going on with me. I'm getting back into writing. I just had a baby. And that's the quick version.
I love it. Do you think that, your baby is 4 months old? A little bit older?
It's 2 months.
2 months only. Oh my God. Well done coming on a podcast. I don't know how you do it. That's amazing. Do you think that having a baby will change how you investigate internet culture? Do you find yourself having thoughts like, oh my God, how will this be by the time my son grows up?
It's already changed it in a couple of ways. The first thing is I've been revisiting a lot of my older work. And this isn't really the internet per se, but I've been realizing I was prioritizing getting insights out as quickly as possible. And I was doing quantity over quality. And now I feel a lot of this doesn't really hold up, right? Or it made sense in the moment, right? I've uncovered a lot of things that really do hold up and should be expanded upon and I feel like real gems, but not everything, right? So I think it's made me more, clear-headed, I think, in a lot of ways. And then two, historically, I've been like very open and friendly with people. I'm very like willing to like let people into my life. I don't like the idea. When I first started, I felt like the relationship with my audience was like I was like up here and I was speaking to like all these anonymous people, and I really didn't like that. So I changed it to we're all equals, right? And you're just in my digital home. And that seems, I don't think I'm going to change the hierarchy, but I do think I'm going to be a little bit more gated.
That's interesting. I remember just, following you on Twitter during these past couple of years that quite a few times you would go private.
Oh, yeah. And I delete
very, much more than myself. I think I went private once. But you have the kind of gears more closely held in your hand. Like you manipulate the system a little bit. Who do you want to reach with what content, when, who can respond? And I've been obviously following you on Substack as well. And I see how strategically you resurface older pieces that you wrote on your blog. What is the editorial consideration there? What makes you, resurface one essay over another?
I haven't had much of a strategy until really this year, because I feel like for a long time, Substack, I would like, there was definitely a lot of people who really like professionalized their Substacks like super early. For me, I feel like it was just like a napkin that I was sharing with other people. Like it was like a scratch pad. And so there was no, it was just, these are like, it's even like reflected in the format of my Substack. A lot of my Substack is, I call it like a thought digest. It's like just a list of shower thoughts, right? And I felt like I had this realization, like a lot of people want to hear what I think. I should be a little bit more discerning. So slowly I've been like going through everything and be like, well, what do I really want to put out into the world? I don't think I'll ever be too curated, just because I don't think I even have the skill set to be, to not just be like totally myself at all times. And I don't mean that in sort of like a pretentious way, right? But I am trying to exercise a little bit more judgment of like, how can I not waste people's time? And so when I like resurface an old piece, whether I wrote it or someone else wrote it, and I thought it was interesting, one, if it's my own, it's to add my own thoughts, to update it, to fix typos even, right? This is something that I've been finding often, there's this very like slipshod nature of what I do. So I'm like, oh, okay, here's what I said, this is what I meant, this is, whether or not it's held up. And then when I resurface old pieces, it's to remind people that like we've been here before. I think that's a huge weakness of a lot of, especially, I don't think this is necessarily true of actual internet culture reporters. I feel like people who are constantly working with the internet, they don't really fall victim to this as often. But when people who aren't immersed in internet culture, try their hand at it, right? And they're like, well, we're all on the internet. We all have something to say about the internet. They don't know the history very well. And that's fair, right? Because it's not a history that we take seriously. I didn't know the history very well until I decided to learn the history. Like I didn't burst onto the scene and know everything. And I still don't know, I'm still not an expert per se, right? Like, it's just a matter of, I want to add more context, and I'm kind of growing along with my readers.
I remember the first time I read one of your blog posts and this feeling that, oh my God, this is digital anthropology. Like there are so many things called digital anthropology, but they all seem to share this characteristic of being the outsider, of looking at these people, weirdos, weird generation, weird subculture, using some tool, doing some strange thing. And I always felt that was a little bit alienating to me as the reader. It brings to mind these really dark moments of like our cultural history when somebody would go to the colonies and have an astute observation about some tribe, and then later on it turns out that ritual is about something completely different, and it has nothing to do with whatever the well-meaning anthropologist had in mind. You do it the other way. You take something that to me seems very personal to you. It's autobiographical. It's our own personal internet history. And you utilize anthropological tools on this personal experience to say, okay, clearly so much has happened just in our short lives so far when it comes to internet experiences. We had dial-up internet, and before that we didn't have internet. Like I remember those periods, and that was just during my teenagers. And today, we spend almost all our lives online, and we communicate with our most intimate friends, partners, children over the internet. But we also consume some of the most high-flying or universally relevant information on us through the internet. And so I'm really curious how this whole default friend thing came to be. I'm pretty sure this name was like your handle in some chat room in 2001. I hope there's a story there. So I'm really curious how you arrived to be the researcher of what you're the researcher of. And if you want to tell the viewers a little bit about just generally the scope of this research or how the scope might have changed.
Yeah, so the default friend, I like the word friend. I just like the word friend. And it was like a tongue-in-cheek thing. Like I wanted to convey like, oh, second best, or like not the first person you call, sort of like everyone else is busy. So
when you get a dinner invitation and you know that I'm not the first, like we're not this close.
Right. Like, the person you everybody else courtesy invite. Right. So that it's like, I don't really like you, and there's I should have thought a little bit about nominative determinism when I chose that handle. And everyone always thought that it was like, oh, I'm your friend by default, right? Like I'll always be your friend. But it wasn't that optimistic. It was kind of self-deprecating. It was relatively new. Like I had thought of it in like 2018. It's because I had been like lurking for so long. Every now and then I would pop up on Twitter, for different reasons, but I didn't have like a static account. I would constantly delete my accounts too. So it was like, I want a static account and I want to like build a personality. And it was, relatively synonymous for a long time. And then in 2019, I decided to like show my face. And then I decided to, choose a pen name that was closer to a real name. That's how Katherine D came about. And all the little investigators have, found my government name to my great dismay initially, but nothing to hide. Originally, when I started writing, it was more like general culture commentary, and it wasn't to. And this has worked in my favor, but it's also been a little bit of a cost, right? But it wasn't to be a career writer. I worked in tech, and I thought I was going to work in tech forever, for as long as until I retired, right? And it was more because it felt like the atmosphere I was in and the communities I was in on Twitter, like one way to communicate and sort of spar and talk to people was through articles, and like there's like a rotation of publications that everyone wrote for, and it wasn't amateurish, right? These are real publications that are very respectable, but at the same time, it wasn't like you kind of knew who like was like you knew the regular readers, and it was more community oriented in a sense. And people kept inviting me on their podcasts to talk about digital community, and I couldn't figure out why they kept why that was the thing that kept coming up. And I realized, oh, it's because this is a theme that like I'm not writing, like when I wrote about like sex and dating, I wasn't writing about sex and dating as it exists in the physical world. A lot of my writing was like even subconsciously focused on the internet. And I think this is true for a lot of people, but I think I was a little bit more explicit about it, but I didn't realize it, right? So what I knew it's true for a lot of people. I think a lot of people don't appreciate how influenced they are by the internet, right? I didn't appreciate that either, but I also didn't appreciate like that I was actually saying, online in these particular places online, you see this, and it was just coming up a lot. And then so I was known for
we did a salon on this as an interjection here. We did a salon on online dating, right? And Esther Perel. We then later on did an offline event with Esther that was phenomenal. But you and I, kind of in the middle of the pandemic, did a conversation on Esther Perel's work, and this whole idea was that, you know, millennial, and this is what Christine Emba later on wrote a book about, Rethinking Sex, which is basically the same idea that, you know, people tell us how we feel. Like millennials are always told how we feel. I think Gen Z will tell you these days the same thing, and Gen Alpha as well. Like you're constantly being told how your generation feels. And then after a moment, you're like, well, I don't know anybody who feels that way. There are actual much bigger trends that are going on emotionally, you know, intellectually, culturally, financially, academically within certain groups of people. And there's this weird dissonance where the experts are just wrong. And you're like, hey, why don't you just ask me? I think there's something in your writing that's just like, let me tell you how we actually feel, what actually happened with us.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Although I'll say that like I've become better at clarifying that like I'm not speaking for or about everyone. It's a pretty like narrow group of people, and I hope it resonates for some. But I've taken a step back, and I had like a really kind of awful wake up call, which is like an interesting story, and it changed my writing a lot, and I think about it a lot. What ended up happening was I interviewed a couple of people for a piece. So it was supposed to be a throwaway piece, right? And I portrayed their experience. I mean, I quoted them, right? So it was clear in the piece that I was, these weren't my original observations. These were about the experience of certain people. But the way I framed it was that their experience was universal. And I was writing about a subculture. And because I trusted them so much, I was like, oh, well, of course they're speaking for everyone. But they're speaking about a subset of people. And it made the community very angry. And I felt I'm still like kind of mortified about it because I let like two people guide my whole opinion of a particular subculture, right? And I realized it's not only it's I have to clarify who exactly I'm talking to and what like precise experience they're speaking to, because you really can't always speak in generalities, right? Or where stereotypes exist, the fault lines might be kind of surprising.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm pretty sure that a lot of the journalists that come across as very jaded or end up doxing lovely bloggers like yourself have had these weird experiences where they were too trusting of a source or something, and then you kind of fall to the other end of the spectrum and you start seeing the source as the enemy or somebody to, completely remove from your plane of reality. I'm very happy that you, instead of making that jump, you just kind of settled in the middle and were like, let's look for a counter argument here. I often feel this when it comes also to like women in tech. Like I'm a female startup founder, and sometimes you wake up with all the idealism in your heart and you want to do something I used to want to do something for fellow female startup founders, and then you realize that we are so weird that we are not a subculture. Like women in tech are generally very unique individuals. What is the common denominator? Not even all of them identify as female. Like how am I going to start? They come from such different backgrounds, have such different problems, and so I just kind of gave up. But then you have the map and territory problem. Like how granular can you get with the subculture? And at the end, you're just left with like one person there who fits the description. And then how are they going to form a minority with some leverage here? I would love to get the gossip of which subculture this was, but I think on purpose you didn't share that, and I respect that. This is so interesting to me. I asked this from Noah Smith as well. And I will ask, I think, every guest who comes on the Hope Axis going forward. You're my second victim. Kat, tell me, what's going on? It's 2024. What is going on in your line of work? How does the world look? And if in 6 years we still exist, and we look back from 2030 on this year 2024. How will we see it, and what will be some things that will be completely obvious in hindsight, but that very few people understand today?
So I don't know if very few people understand this, but I think this is sort of the environment we're already in, but I think it's going to become much more visible. That like the idea of like a national conversation or like general, a general audience is going to continue to fall away, right?
Like back to culture, back to monoculture, back to kind of shared experiences as a nation or family. Or
I don't know if it's a lack of monoculture exactly, but I think like, a content creator, right? And I use that term to encompass a wide range of different professions. Like there won't be a content creator speaking to a general audience, right? That doesn't mean that there won't be a monoculture. The monoculture, I mean, we have a monoculture now, and I think it's strange that people claim that we don't. But in terms of, like content creators, hyper local, like really like hyper local, like at the neighborhood level, or like hyper niche. And I mean, this is the thing that everyone's saying about AI, right? Because AI is going to make it so easy to create content. And that doesn't mean that we'll become overloaded and we won't want it. We'll want it for like, oh, only this person can communicate this idea, right? We're going to get to a point where it's like things become like there's so many versions of one thing, right? Where it's going to be like useless. And the only differentiating factor is like who's communicating it. What's the personality there? The other thing I think
is the ethos, logos kind of try.
Yeah.
The ethos will be the most important. That's very interesting. Zadie Smith has this amazing line, and she wrote an essay about the movie Tar, the Kate Blanchett movie about the conductor and how she ends up being canceled. And she makes this statement in the essay called The Instrumentalist, a wonderful title for an essay for multiple reasons, that the internet has killed the ad hominem, that it has completely blurred the line between opinion and individual, that the opinion is the individual and the individual is the opinion, and that for, internet native generations, this whole fallacy that we used to call ad hominem, well, it doesn't mean anything. Like they don't have the concepts to kind of match with what we're trying to describe. So I think what you're talking about is a kind of extreme version of that.
Yeah, I mean the other thing is I think we'll sort of start dismantling that, right? By like more in-person events, right? Like basically like the two things I use to like guide my sense of what's going on is like what's oversaturated now and what's scarce. And that's a pretty good, you don't have to know anything about anything, right? You just have to make sure you're observing your environment, and then patterns start to emerge. So like what's scarce in a digitally rich environment? That's the physical world. So the physical world becomes more valuable.
I mean, internet has started doing way more offline events, and we do see, I mean, the essay that kicked off Interintellect into existence in the first place was called "We're Niche, We Just Didn't Know," which I published in May 2019. And it argued that the online-offline dichotomy will be gone very soon, because what happens online deeply affects your offline life, and what happens offline will be uploaded or followed up on, digested on the internet. And we see this happening. I never really thought about it from a scarcity, abundance, or saturation point of view, but this is really, really interesting. People deeply crave balance, but we don't know how to do balance at the same time, because if you do it a simultaneous balance, it just feels like mediocrity, like lack of specialization, lack of kind of strong experiences. So what we do is we do one era and then another era and then back and forth. And every time we feel like we have been inventing the wheel from scratch. So now we're like figuring out how to sit around on the grass and have intelligent conversations with each other, which clearly never happened before in the history of mankind.
Yeah, I think you're I think you're right, and I think you're right about the lack of boundary between online and offline. Um, I think that we don't really realize it, especially like in the media, we become very like fixated on internet subcultures or communities that bring themselves into the real world. Um, and we even like frame them as dangerous for some reason, like, oh, it's like a shadowy cabal or something. And like two that come to mind, like sort of immediately, are effective altruism and Dime Square, right? And of course, there's associated scandals with both of them. But the other thing, before these scandals even emerged, um, like there's this real thirst for in-person there's a thirst for people to hang out and in real life. And these communities that are able to blend the power of the internet with the physical world are really attractive and like cool, and like everyone kind of wants a piece of it. And they want a piece of it because we know that the real world is valuable.
I mean, everybody, I think, since Descartes, or maybe since the Greeks, lives in this weird dichotomy where we think that we have software and hardware, mind and body, body and soul, however you put it. And I feel that the internet takes this, this kind of dualist worldview to the extreme. I mean, when transhumanists are talking about, uploading themselves into the cloud, or, we have simulation theory to the three-body problem question of whether our physical emanation is just an illusion programmed by somebody. We are talking about very old philosophical problems. And I think, some kind of middle position about it is correct. The pandemic gave us an idea of what an extreme version of just being software, of just being home, cut off from the physical world, even cut off in some weird way from our own bodies or what our bodies can do in the real world. I think people got scared, and they felt, no, I don't want that.
No, I think you're totally right, and this is manifested in a bunch of different ways. I mean, when TikTok had more like physically oriented challenges, I kind of think that's part of why, right? Like, because it like re-embodied people. Like, people liked to do dances or to eat or to be involved. I think the second reason why is because that those are stickier. Like, they say there's like some kind of like advertising axiom that's like, if you show someone running, right, it's people will remember it better. Something to this effect. I'm probably butchering it. But I also think like the appeal of TikTok was that it was like re-embodying, which is ironic given sort of the criticism of it, especially now. But it's like with TikTok, like you're putting on makeup, you're eating food, you're doing a recipe, you're dancing, you're doing a challenge. It's not just doom scrolling. You don't just scroll, with your mouth agape. You're doing something.
I hope it's a stage only in our lives when being on TikTok counts as doing something. But in terms of posting, yes, and I can be very. I don't know how much you know about the background of the Hope Axis and how this whole idea came about. I had a weird kind of moral crisis earlier this year when I realized that the kind of political polarities that I built my company not around, but like in the shadow of which I built my company, Interintellect, and this organization and this mission as a kind of safety haven / response to it, showing a different way, was gone. Because, the past 10 years were spent in the brutal opposition between what we might call the woke culture or the progressive left and traditional conservative and just ideas, and then you can lump some classical liberals and some libertarians also into that bracket, and I felt that I was still using some of the phrases and some of the concepts that I had developed in the past 10 years, and I started increasingly feeling that these words mean nothing anymore, that what I'm describing is just not there, and then it kind of made me do a more first principles driven investigation, like, okay, then what is there? Like, what are people saying? What do they want? And the two things that I realized, one was very kind of anxiety inducing in me and made me very, gave me a renewed drive to do something about it. But the other was very interesting. What gave me anxiety was that I felt that millennials don't finish their sentences. We are a little bit bland intellectually in the sense that we say things, we ask, we criticize, but we don't really say what we want instead. Like, other than extreme voices, you rarely hear reasonable individuals in the public square making very normative statements about what they want the world to look like, right? So you basically can be like, oh, is liberalism still good? Is feminism still like, okay, then what do you want? Like, okay, everybody can ask a question. If you're an intellectual, if you get paid to do this, I expect you to propose something eventually. You're going to ask a lot of people and then please come up with something.
Well, I mean, do you think they're scared? I mean, we also, the way we censor one another is maybe a little bit harsher. Or maybe there's something about the internet that makes it feel like more of a pressure cooker, like we're always being watched. There's no sort of privacy. I mean, do you think that it's possible that people are scared to say what they want? They know what they want. They just don't want to tell you.
I think it used to be true, and I think it's no longer true. I think we fear something that might no longer really be there, but we are no longer really trying. And I also think that the same way as with, government mandated censorship, for instance, in Eastern Europe for 50 years, people actually lose some kind of epistemological acuity, skill set to sharpen their thoughts. Like, if you really, for a very long time, you never say what you mean, do you even know after a while? I really believe in the as outside is inside idea and the great need for semi-public spaces like Interintellect where you can have open discussions. I think, if you can't say something for a very long time, you might also stop thinking it after a while. I think we internalize censorship. So I do think that, this unhappy realization earlier this year made me very motivated to create more like debate-like discussion spaces to help regain the epistemological habit of at least trying to formalize and formulate what we want. With the intellectual community, like, look, I might be wrong. Like, I can only formulate these things based on what I know now. If you bring me new information, and to me that seems like a legit piece of information, I might update, right? We are not making religious proclamations here. We are just offering assessments on how the world currently looks. But the other thing that I realized, which was a little bit more hopeful for me, was that I could create a perfect 2x2 where the horizontal axis was just left and right, and the vertical axis was basically people who think that the best things have already happened versus people who think that the best things are yet to come. And then you can see that the traditional woke group would be basically people who think that the past was bad, sinful, racist, for very obvious reasons and for often very good reasons. And then you have the kind of old-timey conservatives who think that the past was good, and there are a lot of things there to cherish and preserve and bring on. But the real new axis where culture is taking place is between what I called basically the Autist culture. And this is a very poetic name for it. So people in tech, people in progress studies, effective altruists, although they are a little bit more on the left, I think are still there. Everybody working on AI, even the doomers. So it's a very rationalist, very pro-future way of actively shaping how things should turn out. They are the future will be good group. And then at the end of it, in the lower left quadrant, you have what I call the public nostalgics, who are united by just thinking that the future will be bad. So instead of the past was bad and the past was good, which was the thing to discuss for the past 10 years, we are talking about basically, will there be a future or not? And are you willing to participate? And I call this the hope axis, and hence the title of this podcast. To me, that's fascinating. I think
what about how they feel about the present? Right? Is there a different space for those? Because I feel like then that's sort of important too.
How do you feel about the present?
I like the present moment. There's I think certain things can be better, but I think that a lot of people don't. I think I increasingly fall into the we don't have enough gratitude camp.
Or maybe the people who are satisfied, they just don't post.
Yeah, maybe. But because I think like
happy families are all alike because they are not online that much.
It's like, you think of like, you mentioned like AI optimists, right? Like techno-utopians. Some techno-utopians, like the present moment is wonderful and it can only get better, right? But some of them say like, it's actually quite bad and like, we're going to make it better. And I think that's sort of like a important distinction too.
Like one is almost like a conservationist instinct that whatever is here to. That's really interesting. I think, I created a kind of a center group. I call them, I've been working on this concept a little bit for my new Substack series that I call a collaborative relationship with the world, as something that I would like to see more of, which is not this self-sacrificial abandon into the affairs of the world where, we shun the personal, we think that, you should dedicate yourself to a job or to a cause and diminish all other parts of your life. But it is also not this kind of micro program of productivity, abs, beauty tips on Instagram, everything small, but somewhere in the middle. I think, people are in the middle. Usually not simultaneously. We are in the middle because we revert to the mean after exploring different polarities. But also politically, even in the most polarized moments, even in America or France, most people are in the middle. Like most people are just decent human beings who want to live with virtue and have a family and food on the table and, go on a holiday every once in a while and not get sick. And they are people that we rarely hear about. On the other hand, we know that whatever becomes the mainstream culture, the midway, the collaborative relationship with the world, often starts in the fringes. And this is why your work is so interesting to me, because you have this enormous compassion with the fringes as well, understanding that someday a part of this will be so mainstream, we will never remember where it came from. The same way as we don't always critically, look at our environment and think about all the things that didn't exist before somebody invented them. Do you think that the nature of subcultures are changing? Do you think that when you started your investigation, which I imagine has been going on for the past 20 years, more or less officially, has the meaning of subculture changed at all?
A little bit. I think people are a little bit too pessimistic about like, subcultures don't exist. I think we don't like recognize what is and isn't a subculture, and we're really quick to write things off. Here's a example I've been thinking about lately. Common criticism of TikTok is, TikTok is constantly generating these aesthetics, right? Basically, like, is constantly generating like fashion styles or whatever, and each fashion style has like a name, like like mob wife or tomato girl or whatever, right? And people are like, young women and teen girls see this and they sub it into a personality, and consumerism has subsumed the subculture, and subcultures don't exist. And that here's an example of how people are just refreshing their personality based on these aesthetics every week, whatever. But I think that's short-sighted. The subculture is the aesthetics as an umbrella, right? It's the people who want to adopt each aesthetic each week, right? And I think that because it's the same people who are introducing and talking about and analyzing and teaching about these aesthetics and who are engaging in it, it's all the same people who are switching out each week, and they're all friends, and there's certain creators who they follow, and whatever, and that is a subculture. And we don't think it's one because we don't realize the ways in which they're connected. And we also, like in the past, it was much easier to signal subcultural affiliation with like what you're wearing, or hanging out in a physical space. And so we could say like, oh, well, mall goths hang out at the mall and they look like this, and and they listen to this, and I recognize them very easily, right? But it's not not quite the same. It's not as different as we think. Another example is, the online right gets a disproportionate amount of attention from the press. It'd be probably because they're on Twitter. They're represented on Twitter quite a bit, and so are journalists. But they're a group where it's like that's a subculture, a subculture with many different subsets. And where do they hang out? They hang out on Twitter and Discord. And I'm sure they're on forums and stuff. And there's other places they hang out, but that's a public place where we see them. And there's all these different examples of that. I don't think it's really that different than like, oh, I go to the mall and I eat Panda Express or whatever, and I see the goths hanging out in front of Hot Topic or Spencer's or whatever. It's like I go on Twitter, I doom scroll, and I see the online right hanging out.
I love that. That's so interesting. Do you think that, is there a subculture that mistakenly thinks that it's mainstream? And is there a mainstream culture that mistakenly still sees itself as a subculture?
I think there's many different answers for, like subcultures that think they're mainstream, but they aren't. But I will say, and this is something I got into a lot of arguments about, like a lot of different flavors of like left, like especially like once digital leftist subcultures still think they're at the fringes, and they're pretty well represented in mainstream media. And same with like this is a little bit I don't want to, a little bit controversial, I guess is the word I'm looking for, but there's certain like queer identities which I also consider to be subcultures in certain cases, which are like very well represented in the media, in like the few like big movies we have left and whatever, and they still think that they're on the fringe. And it's like, that's not really true anymore. It was true in the 90s, and it was probably even true in the early 2010s and the 2000s, but it's not true anymore.
But is it is it like helpful for a culture, whether sub or mainstream, to think that is a subculture? Like, how there's like the underdog mentality, like even when which I think is very controversial and we can argue about it. But some people think that you should always think about yourself as the underdog, never as the incumbent, always like fight. Is this same for cultural groups?
I don't know if it's I think it's bad because because you need to create new culture, or to even be drawn to new cultures, right? Like subcultures serve a purpose, and they don't live forever, and they constantly are reinventing themselves. And if you're in denial of that, I think it sort of holds you back, and it prevents progress too, right? Like something so tangentially related. A lot of older millennials and Gen Xers, I've observed, like especially like in culture war stuff, are like constantly like relitigating cultural battles of like the early 2000s, right? And this was much more prominent before the 2020 election, I feel. But I would constantly see people who were like arguing as though it was still, Bush era. And it's like, well, we've moved past that, right? And it's like, what are you holding yourself back from experiencing or fighting for, even, by being stuck in the past, right? Like you need to move on.
What is a conversation that people should be having more often, more vigorously, but they don't see the tree from the forest, so to speak?
I think the way we talk about it, especially in the mainstream, I don't think this is true of like us, or probably many of the people watching this or listening to it. I don't know. But the good things about the internet, I think I agree. Like it sucks when like you're eating dinner with someone and they're staring at their phone or something. But there's been many benefits of increase connectivity.
I think we have to internet, right? The good internet, and it's good internet IS, and it's about like, don't project your personal manias and regrets onto this neutral thing. Like, there's so much. We wouldn't know each other without the internet. We would have a conversation now between like New York City and Chicago. We are in different time zones, without this incredible invention.
Right. I mean, that's true for a lot of people. Like, a lot of people who are like warning about the deleterious impacts of the internet are doing it over the internet. It's like
social media is bad, he said on social media.
Right. And, I understand that could be like a silly counter argument, but it's like, well, social media gave you the platform. It, for some people, it gave them the opportunity to write, to be discovered, to find a hobby, to find a job. I mean, there's all these things, and it makes certain things worse, right? But for us to improve our relationship with technology, we have to also see like, well, why did we want it in the first place? Yeah. Right.
And what is the motivation there?
Yeah, like what is it helping? And then we can talk, we can talk about both, right? Another thing, which is related to this is I think we kind of underappreciate like free speech and how meaningful it is to us. I mean, the answer might be like, we don't value free speech, right? But I don't see that conversation happening. Know what it
is. Like, we are confused about the definition. We are confused about the use cases.
Yeah, exactly. And it's there's so many like proposed restrictions on on many different things, right? Whether it's social media or pornography, there's free speech impacts down the line that I don't think we really think about. And I think because we're moving so fast, right? And where everything is sort of like surface level, which that's because of social media, right? So it's like it's happening. It's it's everything. Everything is two sides.
What if our viewers or listeners want to get acquainted with a good thinker when it comes to internet and free speech, where should they start?
That's a good question. Let's see. So I always recommend people start with Sherry Turkle, who I feel like she like really changed the way I thought about the internet. And I almost feel like, is there anyone, isn't there anyone else, right? But I guess that's always going to be my recommendation. And then Humdog, who I wrote about her for the New Atlantis. And then Julian DeBell. And I would say like start with those three, and then you'll start finding more through them. It's interesting, like all the 90s internet criticism or culture writing really holds up. And it's strange because I think it holds up even better than some that was written in like the 2010s, right? Especially like
so interesting. Are we back to the
I think because they had more foresight, maybe, or maybe like they had the more distance in a way. Like they weren't all so. It wasn't the water they swam in, so it was easier for them to project.
Sure. Yeah, Sherry Turkle was very influential for the first incarnation of Interintellect, which was much more technical. Because Interintellect right now is a very low tech company. Yeah, that's fascinating that you would say Turkle. Maybe we should bring her in for an Interintellect salon. That would be very interesting to talk to her. I love idea genealogy and philosophical genealogy and see how ideas, run from one from the other. But it's even more interesting when it's within an individual's life and how his or her ideas evolve and develop. I would love to hear from you what you think is your big idea. Like if people had to, in 100 years, remember you by one idea, which one it should be. And do you want to maybe guide us through the genealogy, like how that evolved or how you arrived at that particular consideration?
This is going to be terrible, right? But I don't think I have a big idea. I don't think I'm like a big, a significant like thinker. I will say, if I have any
big in proportion to you.
Sure.
We are
But,
not in the business of trying to decide what an objective big idea will be in 100 years. We can only tell for ourselves compared with our other ideas.
but what I was going to follow up with is maybe like method is more important than idea in my case. And try, there's a fine line between like empathy and then just like letting people sort of like walk all over you and you lose your own narrative control. And that's something that I'm still learning and I think, but like recently I've gotten much better at.
If people are looking like
right, so like I've been like turning the dials like my whole like writing career on like I want to be empathetic towards people and let them say their piece, but I should also remain. I should have my own editorial voice, right? And so just if you ever impart anything on anyone, I feel like almost embarrassed to say it, but like compassion and to like really hear people out, and to sit with their stories for a while, and not to like jump to boxing them in, because you'd sort of be surprised. And I think you'll have more creative ideas and more creative interpretations if you let the stories sit on its own for a little bit, and then see like, all right, what can I learn from this? I think that's sort of what makes me a little bit different, right?
So not letting the say the interviewee hijack the conversation and define the message, but also there's the other side of it where the journalist, the podcaster arrives with their own agenda, and basically whatever this person says, they will be like, here's my agenda.
Right.
I use this poor person to kind of illustrate against their will.
Exactly. I mean, and I also think there's always like a story beneath the story, and these are things that people know, but I don't think they like hold on to tightly enough, right? Like, I interviewed someone who, like very recently, who's very well known for the role they played in a big like cultural event. I'm not going to say who it was, right? But and any other person interviewing them, and because I listened to a whole bunch of interviews they had done, is about this cultural event, right? And if there's any like story beneath that, it's like, oh, they're a bad person for the role that they played. But even beneath that, there's like another story, and I realized like the story here is that this is a person who's always wanted to be famous and has always wanted an audience, and for whatever, and should have been in a different line of work. And because of all these other factors, ended up this like cultural villain to at least a certain set of people, right? And so there's always something running, running in the background. So in 100 years, let me, even if it's just as a footnote, I hope I serve as like one more reminder, right? Like to be more holistic and to be compassionate and to see what emerges.
I mean, this is so important, and maybe this will be, on the wall of journalism schools if they still exist and make any sense. In maybe a journalism school as a kind of phrase will be meaningless from both sides in 100 years. This is really interesting to me. I think a lot of people experience something like that in their personal life, and because you do this professionally, you can look at it in a more. I mean, this is where we started the entire conversation, right? Like you take an autobiographical insight and try to understand it from, universal perspective that works for private, professional, political, public, etc., communication. Maybe you are more of a communication philosopher than a digital anthropologist. Maybe I will update your job spec in my mind to better cover the reality. This is fascinating. As a kind of outro, what are you working on these days? Where will we read you next? And is there a classic by Katherine D whether our blog or New Atlantis or Blaze or Unheard, that people should read when they get acquainted further with your work?
Sure. So I've been working on moving my blog away from just like I said, like napkin notes to like real, like a little bit more put together, a little bit more polished. And so part of that is like revamping the computer room to be more narrative and in some ways, and to right as it's sort of like a lot of info dumps, and that I'm focusing more on story. And then I think if you want to read like a Katherine D classic, usually I would say How Tumblr Transformed American Politics, but I think the better one, and like a more updated version of how I think, is called Computer Love, and it's about like mediated relationships, and trying to answer a question that popped into my head fall 2022. Can you pair bond during cyber sex? Who knows?
I need to find out. I have to do an interview at some point about this short film that I wrote and I won an award with, actually, when I was still a film writer, that was about justice. It was called
Oh, cool.
Opening. I think it never got made, or I don't know what happened. I completely left the industry in 2012, but it was asking similar questions. Thank you so much, Kat. This has been such a joy, and I'm so happy for your growing family and everything that you do. And I'm, surfacing some of your older pieces through your Substack gives me an opportunity in many cases to read them for the first time. I think we were all very busy in like 2020 with so much that I doubt that everybody read everything that, but people produced some of their best work in that year. So I'm so happy to, and I always try to encourage writers, artists to repost, reshare. Maybe somebody missed it. It's not bad to self-promote. You're actually helping people to discover more good content. And what is wrong with that?
I agree. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And everybody who watched us or listened to us, go and listen to the Computer Room as well. We are friends and not competitors. And read the default blog.